actually Queen Mary that started this particular trend off with inside the British monarchy. Oh yes, you see, she was a huge fan of this legend, and it's hard to imagine exactly how the Germanic-born Queen Mary understood a lot of the, shall we say, idiosyncrasies of this particular film, theatre, and of course recording legend. We're talking about the one and only late and brilliant George Formby. As ever, let me explain. Hi, nice to see you. Thank you so much as ever for your time today. Now, George Formby, I don't know if you know him around the world, but it's hard to really surmise how fabulously big he was, as a performer. I mean, literally in the sort of late 30s, all the way through to the 40s, middle 50s, he was an epic star. I mean, to give him some sort of credence, he would be up there with Tom Cruise in terms of box office. He could literally fill cinemas night after night and theatres and summer seasons literally night after night. Thousands of people enjoyed him. His real sort of thing, though, came when he got banned, oh yes, by the ubiquitous BBC, because apparently his records were seen as too naughty, too frivolous, with things like With My Little Stick of Blackpool Rock and When I'm Cleaning Windows. When you listen to it now, there's sort of very innocent things that you come away and think, well, doesn't really, is it that matter when you consider, like, say, years later, Relax by Frankie Goes to Hollywood was similarly banned by BBC Radio 1, and then that went to number one, right? But there was a big scandal surrounding this particular legend, and really, as I say, the British monarchy absolutely adored him. It was the late Queen Mary that introduced George Formby to the Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret, and at first the Queen Mother wasn't too sure, but saw the delight that the children had in the songs, and as it's often been said, the mimicry that Queen Elizabeth could do. She could literally take him off brilliantly, and apparently did so when he was given a private audience at Buckingham Palace to entertain Queen Mary, King George and Queen Elizabeth, then of course latterly known as the Queen Mother. But what happened really was this, and it was something that, when you think about it, as I often say here on the show, wouldn't really bat an eyelid in today's society. But at that time, in the early 1960s, a lot of things were considered very risque. It was, of course, the start of swinging London, the permissive society, all of those things were to come in that decade. But at the end of the 1950s, George Formby's world collapsed, and he wondered if he'd actually seen the last of the royals. Let me explain. See, it was well known in royal circles that he was very popular with the British monarchy. And as you can see here, George was pictured with Queen Mary. And, as I say, she took all the records, went to see all the films and had them screened in Buckingham Palace alongside the two young princesses. They just adored him. He was funny, and to sort of, I suppose the thing you would put him in if you wanted to would be in the light comedy thing of Laurel and Hardy, not a slapstick, but more gormless, as we say in the north, bit of a fool, never quite got the girl. But behind the scenes, he had a darker side. He had a very sort of tempestuous marriage to his manager and wife, Beryl. She really ruled him with an iron rod, giving him spending money, and basically the only big thing he was allowed to spend on was a house near Blackpool, which he then christened Beryldine. You can understand exactly how powerful she was. She'd been a performer herself, but had decided to invest her time in George, and that was proven wise because he became, as I say, an international star. Sadly, she passed away in the early 60s through cancer, but very quickly, in a matter of weeks, George announced his engagement to Pat Howson. Now, Pat Howson had been a family friend, all thanks to her father and the Rolls Royces that the Formbys had. He often used to change cars every single year. That was his luxury for him and Beryl. They loved fast cars, and the Rolls Royces and the number plates changed accordingly. But what's fascinating is, as I say, very quickly, Pat and George suddenly became engaged. Now, she was something of a quiet church mouse, not at all the outgoing sort of person that Beryl was. But as George said at the time, he needed somebody to look after him. This, as you can imagine, caused an absolute uproar in the media of the moment. So much so that, the royal family were asked, are you still fans of George Formby? They were trying to push them in a different direction. Naturally, they didn't respond to that. The Queen Elizabeth and Princess Margaret privately still liked him. He was a throwback from their childhood. Very nice, warm memories, as you can imagine. But he was concerned that he wouldn't be allowed to once again ever appear in front of royalty. Such was the negativity of the PR. Sadly though, he needn't have worried, because literally that particular year they were already in talks about including him for that year's Royal Variety performance. He'd had something of a resurgence, all thanks to a BBC TV special which had really triggered memories about his talent and popularity during the Second World War. Sadly though for George, that was never to be. Literally, after having a visit from his fiancée in the hospital, sadly within a matter of an hour or so, he had his very final fatal heart attack. And so for George, of course, he never truly knew whether the royal family had forgiven him or indeed discarded him or not. They didn't want to tell him the excitement about the Royal Variety in case it triggered any more problems or palpitations. But apparently, according to sources, the Queen still played his records and often screened his films for other members of the royals to try and convert them into what exactly she saw alongside her sister about the very talented and now brilliantly late George Formby. And of course, the scandal certainly didn't bother them. The royals know one or two things about royal scandals, right? Neil Sean in the very heart of London.